The courtroom was half empty, but the laughter carried like it was full. Marcus sat perfectly still, hands folded over a manila envelope, while opposing counsel wiped tears from his eyes. "Your Honor," the attorney said, still chuckling, "my client requests we skip to the ruling." The judge didn't smile. She said, "I think you'll want to sit down for this." Priscilla, his wife, soon to be his ex-wife. She was a vision in a cream-colored Chanel suit, her blonde hair coiffed into an elegant chignon. She looked every bit the Charleston socialite she had desperately worked to become. Beside her sat her attorney, Sterling Hayes, a man who seemed assembled from a catalog of clichés. The razor-sharp pinstripe suit, the gleaming Rolex, the predatory smile that never quite reached his cold blue eyes. Hayes was in his element, pacing before the judge like a panther toying with its prey, and the prey, unequivocally, was Marcus. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice a smooth, condescending baritone that echoed in the hushed room. "We are here today for a simple, straightforward dissolution of marriage. My client, Mrs. Okafor, seeks nothing more than what is fair. Unfortunately, fairness is a difficult concept when one party brings absolutely nothing to the table." He gestured dismissively toward Marcus. "Mr. Okafor, you see, is a woodworker." He said the word as if it were a contagion, a piece of filth he had to pluck from his tongue. "A hobbyist. He spends his days in a dusty, dilapidated shed behind the marital home. A home, I must add, that was purchased entirely with my client's family inheritance. He makes little trinkets, knickknacks, perhaps a wobbly chair here, a rustic bookshelf there." A few titters rippled through Priscilla's side of the gallery, where her coterie of friends, women with equally perfect hair and equally predatory smiles, sat in support. Marcus felt the heat rise to his cheeks, but kept his gaze fixed on the grain of the table in front of him. It was American black walnut, a beautiful, strong wood. He focused on its patterns, the story it told of seasons and struggles, to keep himself anchored. "For 10 years, Sterling continued, his voice dripping with theatrical pity, "my client has supported Mr. Okafor's artistic pursuits. She has graciously allowed him to indulge in his little hobby, never pressuring him to seek, shall we say, meaningful employment. She hosted the parties, she maintained the social standing, she managed the household finances, all while Mr. Okafor made sawdust." Priscilla dabbed at a perfectly dry eye with a lace handkerchief, a flawless performance of a long-suffering wife. Marcus remembered the day he'd built the mahogany chest where she kept those handkerchiefs. He'd spent a month on it, using intricate dovetail joints he'd learned from a book on 18th century Japanese cabinetry. He'd presented it to her on their anniversary. She'd smiled politely and said, "Oh, that's nice, Marcus. It'll be useful for storage." She never once commented on the wood, the craftsmanship, or the heart he had poured into it. She'd never asked. "The financial disclosures, Your Honor, are laughably one-sided," Hayes said, snatching a thin folder from his desk. "My client has provided meticulous records of her assets, her inheritance, her investment portfolio, the deed to the home. Mr. Okafor, on the other hand, has submitted a single-page statement from a local credit union. The balance, as of last week, was a paltry $742.16. He held up the paper as if it were a soiled napkin. $700. That is the sum total of this man's contribution to a decade-long marriage. He has no assets, no savings, no 401k, no property. He has only his splinters and his delusions of being an artisan." The word hung in the air, heavy with scorn. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief second. He could smell the cedar shavings from the armoire he was currently building. He could feel the satisfying heft of his favorite hand plane, the one his grandfather had brought over from Nigeria, its wooden body worn smooth by 3 generations of Okafors. His grandfather had taught him that wood has a spirit. "You don't just cut it, Marcus," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "You listen to it. You ask it what it wants to become." Priscilla had never set foot in his workshop. Not once in 10 years. In the beginning, he'd tried to invite her in. "Come see this piece of curly maple, Scylla. The grain looks like a flowing river." She'd wave a dismissive hand, her nose wrinkled. "Marcus, please, you'll track sawdust all over my Persian rugs. Just keep your hobby out there." It started as a hobby. After he was laid off from his architectural drafting job during the recession, woodworking became his solace. It was a place where precision and soul could meet. He started with small things, jewelry boxes, picture frames. Then he moved on to tables, chairs, cabinets. He poured all the quiet parts of himself into the wood. His frustrations, his joys, his unspoken loneliness within his own home. He found that the wood listened better than his wife ever did. He started a simple website, a clean, minimalist portfolio of his work. He took high-resolution photos, capturing the light as it caught the unique grain of each piece. He wrote descriptions not about dimensions, but about the origin of the wood, the feeling he hoped the piece would evoke. He called his brand Okafor Handcraft. He didn't advertise. He just put his work out into the world, a message in a bottle tossed into the vast ocean of the internet. For a year, nothing happened. Then, an email arrived. It was from an interior designer in London. She'd stumbled upon his site and was captivated by a console table he'd made from a single slab of reclaimed cypress, salvaged from a Charleston church built in the 1800s. She wanted to commission a similar one for a client. The price she offered was more than he'd made in 3 months at his old drafting job. He'd tried to tell Priscilla that night, his heart thrumming with a nervous excitement he hadn't felt in years. He found her on the veranda, sipping a Sauvignon Blanc and scrolling through her phone. "Scylla, I have some amazing news," he'd said, his voice brimming. "Hold on, Marcus," she'd replied, not looking up. "Meredith is posting photos from the regatta. Did you see the hat Carol Ann wore? Ghastly." He waited. She kept scrolling. The moment passed, the excitement curdling into a familiar resignation in his chest. He went back to his workshop, the silence of the space a welcome comfort. He decided then that his work was his own. It was the one part of his life she couldn't touch, couldn't judge, couldn't diminish with her apathy. It was his sanctuary. The London commission led to another, and another. An architect in Dubai saw his work and commissioned 25 pieces for the lobby of a new 7-star hotel. A boutique hotelier in Kyoto wanted custom furniture for their entire executive suite collection, requesting he use traditional Japanese joinery techniques. The requests poured in, all through a secure online portal he'd set up with the help of a tech-savvy friend. They wanted his story, his touch, his quiet dedication. They wanted the soul he put into the wood. He opened a separate business account with an international bank. He hired a small, discreet logistics team to handle shipping. He bought a larger workshop in a commercial district on the outskirts of the city, but kept the small shed in the backyard for his personal projects, maintaining the illusion for Priscilla. The money that flowed in was staggering, almost abstract. He never touched it for personal use. He lived the same simple life, wearing the same flannel shirts and worn jeans. The money wasn't the point. The work was. The validation of his craft was. Back in the courtroom, Sterling Hayes was winding up for his grand finale. So, what we have is a classic, if rather pathetic case of a man who has leeched off a successful, generous woman. My client is not seeking alimony. She does not wish to prolong this man's parasitic existence. She simply wants what is hers, her house, her assets, and her freedom from a man who has contributed nothing but the faint smell of sawdust to her life. We asked the court to affirm the asset division as submitted and grant the dissolution. Mr. Okafor can have his shed and his $700. He sat down, a smug smirk playing on his lips. Priscilla looked at him with undisguised admiration. Marcus's own lawyer, a quiet older man named Ben Carter, looked weary. Ben had been a friend of his father's. He was a good man, but he seemed outmatched by Sterling's venomous theatrics. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, her voice tired. "A response?" Ben stood slowly. "Your Honor, Mr. Hayes paints a very specific picture of my client, a picture that is incomplete." Sterling scoffed loudly. "Incomplete? What's missing? A secret lottery win? A hidden treasure map?" The judge shot him a warning glare. "Mr. Hayes, you will allow counsel to speak without interruption." She turned her gaze to Ben. "Continue, Mr. Carter." "My client does not dispute that Mrs. Okafor's inheritance purchased the home," Ben said calmly. "He does not lay claim to her personal investment portfolio. He has never asked for a penny from her. However, the assertion that he has no assets is factually incorrect." Priscilla leaned over and whispered something to Sterling, who chuckled and shook his head. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, a hint of impatience in her tone, "the financial disclosure from your client shows a single bank account with a balance under $1,000. Are you suggesting there are other documents we haven't seen?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ben said, his voice steady. "There are." He walked to his briefcase and pulled out a thick, spiral-bound document. It was not a thin folder like Sterling's. It was a comprehensive financial portfolio, several inches thick. He placed it gently on the clerk's desk. "This is the full financial disclosure for my client's business, Okafor Handcraft, LLC." Sterling Hayes stood up abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an ambush. We were provided with a single notarized statement. This is a deliberate attempt to mislead the court." The judge held up a hand. "Mr. Hayes, sit down. The discovery rules require a full disclosure of all personal assets. Is Okafor Handcraft, LLC, a personal asset?" she asked Ben. "It is a sole proprietorship, Your Honor. The business and my client are, for tax and asset purposes, one and the same," Ben explained. "We provided the personal checking account statement as requested. We were never asked for a business portfolio because your clients operated under the assumption that no such business existed." The judge's eyes narrowed. She gestured for the clerk to bring her the document. The silence in the courtroom returned, but this time it was different. It was charged with confusion and a dawning curiosity. Priscilla was no longer looking serene. A small frown line had appeared between her perfectly sculpted eyebrows. The judge, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, who had a reputation for suffering no fools, put on a pair of reading glasses and opened the portfolio. She flipped through the first few pages, her expression unreadable. She turned another page, then another. She paused. She took off her glasses, polished them with a cloth, and put them back on, leaning closer to the document. The courtroom held its breath. Marcus watched the judge's face. He saw her eyebrows lift slightly. She turned another page, her finger tracing a long column of numbers. He could see Priscilla shifting in her seat, whispering urgently to Sterling, who was trying to wave her off with a confident flick of his wrist, though his own smile was beginning to look strained. Judge Vance continued to read, her movements slow and deliberate. She flipped past sections detailing asset acquisitions, rare lumber sourced from sustainable forests in Costa Rica, specialized German and Japanese tools, a commercial property deed. She lingered on the statements of accounts receivable, noting contracts with names like the Sovereign Sands Group, Dubai, Kyoto Bloom Hospitality, and the Alpine Reserve, Switzerland. Finally, she reached the last page, the consolidated statement of assets from the business's primary bank. She stared at it for a long, silent minute. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the frantic beating of Marcus's own heart. This was it. The part of his life he had kept hidden, not out of shame, but for its own protection, was about to be laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the court. When Judge Vance finally looked up, her gaze was sharp and intense. She looked first at Sterling Hayes, then at Priscilla. Then her eyes settled on Marcus. There was no pity in her look now. There was something else. Respect. She cleared her throat. The sound was like a gavel strike in the silent room. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice low and dangerously calm, "you have spent the last 30 minutes painting a portrait of Mr. Okafor as an indigent hobbyist, a man who has contributed nothing to this marriage." "And I stand by that assertion, Your Honor," Sterling blustered, trying to regain his footing. "A last-minute fabricated document doesn't change the facts." "Fabricated?" Judge Vance's voice was laced with ice. "This portfolio has been prepared by a top-tier international accounting firm. It includes notarized bank statements, authenticated international contracts, and federal tax returns for the past 7 years. Are you accusing Deloitte of fabrication, Mr. Hayes?" Sterling's face went pale. Deloitte. The name hung in the air, a testament to a level of financial seriousness that utterly dismantled his narrative. "No, Your Honor, You just didn't do your due diligence," the judge cut him off. "You took your client's word for it. You saw a man with sawdust on his jeans and you made an assumption, a deeply flawed, unprofessional assumption." She turned her steely gaze to Priscilla. "Mrs. Okafor, you claim your husband has no assets, that he has never contributed financially. Were you aware that your husband's hobby is, in fact, a registered LLC? Priscilla's face was a mask of confusion. A what? No. He makes things in the shed. It's dirty work. I see, the judge said, her voice devoid of sympathy. And were you aware that Okafor Handcraft, LLC, is the exclusive furniture provider for the Royal Sentosa hotel chain in Southeast Asia? Priscilla's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. Were you aware, the judge continued, her voice rising with each question, that his work is featured in architectural magazines in Europe and Japan? That a single one of his dining tables, like the one commissioned for the penthouse of the Emirates Towers, sells for upwards of $200,000? A collective gasp went through the gallery. Sterling Hayes looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. He sank back into his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. Were you aware, Mrs. Okafor, the judge said, her voice now a powerful crescendo, that during your 10-year marriage, a marriage in which you claim he contributed nothing, your husband's business, which he built from nothing, generated a net profit of... She paused, looking down at the final number on the page, as if to ensure she was reading it correctly. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Priscilla's. A net profit of $48,627,904. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was a vacuum. It sucked the air from the room, leaving everyone breathless. 48 million. The number seemed impossible, nonsensical. Priscilla's perfectly made-up face had gone slack with shock. The color had drained from it, leaving her looking haggard and old. Her eyes, which had looked at Marcus with such pity and disdain, were now filled with a wild, desperate confusion. She was looking at him as if for the first time, but he was a stranger to her, a phantom she had lived with but never seen. Marcus just sat there, his hands still resting on the walnut table. He felt no triumph, no glee, just a profound, aching sadness. This was the moment his secret life came into the light, and it felt less like a victory and more like an autopsy of his marriage. All those years, all that success, and she had never once been curious enough to open the door to his workshop. She'd never asked, "How was your day, Marcus?" and actually listened to the answer. She'd never wondered what he was creating with his hands, with his heart. She saw a man in a dusty shirt, not the artist sought after by the world's most discerning clients. Judge Vance let the silence hang for another moment before she spoke, her voice now calm but firm. This court has been presented with two vastly different financial pictures. On the one hand, we have Mrs. Okafor, who came into this marriage with a significant inheritance which she has by all accounts maintained. On the other hand, we have Mr. Okafor, who came into this marriage with very little, but who, during the marriage, built a global enterprise through his own skill, his own labor, and his own vision. She looked directly at Priscilla. You claim he contributed nothing. The evidence shows he contributed everything that was built during this union. The irony is that you were so blinded by your own perception of status that you failed to see the incredible value in the man sitting next to you. You disdained his work, you belittled his passion, and in doing so, you rendered yourself completely ignorant of the marital estate you now seek to divide. She turned the page in the portfolio. The law is clear. Assets acquired during a marriage are typically considered marital property. However, this is a court of equity, and equity demands fairness. It is clear to this court that the assets of Okafor Handcraft were generated without any support, financial, emotional, or otherwise, from Mrs. Okafor. In fact, her own testimony suggests she actively discouraged it and held it in contempt. Sterling Hayes, finally finding his voice, croaked out, "Your Honor, surely my client is entitled to half of the marital assets." Entitled? Judge Vance's voice was sharp as a chisel. Entitlement is a dangerous word, Mr. Hayes. What is your client entitled to? The fruits of a labor she openly mocked? The profits from a business she didn't even know existed? She never washed a single dusty shirt, never brought him a cup of coffee in his workshop, never attended a single business meeting because she didn't know they were happening. She created a wall between her life and his, and now she wants to claim ownership of what grew on the other side of that wall. That is not equity. That is opportunism. The judge closed the portfolio with a definitive thud. The court makes the following ruling. the marital home, having been purchased with Mrs. Okafor's premarital assets, remains her sole and separate property. Her personal investments and inheritance are likewise hers. She will not be required to pay alimony. Priscilla's expression flickered with a brief moment of relief, thinking she had at least secured her own world. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court finds that the business, Okafor Handcraft, LLC, and all assets therein are the sole and separate property of Mr. Marcus Okafor. Priscilla's face crumpled. No, she whispered, the sound barely audible. No, that's not fair. Fairness, Mrs. Okafor, is a mirror, the judge said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its authority. You wanted a life separate from your husband's work. You have it. This marriage is dissolved. She banged the gavel, the sound cracked through the stunned silence. We are adjourned. As the judge swept from the room, chaos erupted on the other side of the aisle. Priscilla was openly weeping now, not the delicate performative dabs from before, but ugly gasping sobs of genuine loss. Not the loss of her husband, Marcus knew, but the loss of a future she had just discovered and had destroyed in the same instant. Sterling Hayes was trying to console her, his own face a mess of disbelief and professional humiliation. He had been so sure, so arrogant. He had laughed at Marcus. Now, the entire courtroom was staring at the ruin he had created. Marcus stood up slowly. Ben Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. Are you all right, son? Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was. He felt hollowed out, as if one of his own chisels had carved away something deep inside him. He walked past Priscilla and Sterling without a word. He didn't look at them. Their drama felt small and distant now. As he reached the courthouse doors, he heard her call his name. Marcus! He stopped but didn't turn around. Marcus, please, she begged, her voice thick with tears. We can talk about this. I didn't know. Why didn't you ever tell me? The question, the one he had dreaded and expected, finally came. He turned slowly to face her. Her makeup was running, her perfect facade shattered. For the first time, she looked truly vulnerable. He thought of all the times he had tried, all the small openings he had offered, only to be met with a wall of indifference. He thought of the joy he'd wanted to share, the pride he'd felt, and how he had learned to keep it all for himself, because sharing it with her was more painful than keeping it silent. He looked her in the eye, and his voice was not angry, but quiet and heavy with the weight of 10 years of unspoken truth. You never asked. With that, he turned and walked out of the courthouse, into the bright, humid Charleston sunshine. He felt the sun on his face, a warmth that felt like a new beginning. He was free, not just from a marriage, but from the need for approval from someone who was incapable of giving it. The next week, Marcus didn't go to his workshop. He drove downtown to a small, unassuming building on the east side of the city. It was the Charleston Vocational Institute, a non-profit that ran a training program for at-risk young men, teaching them skills in carpentry, masonry, and electrical work. He had read an article about them, about how they were struggling with old equipment and dwindling city funds. He met with the director, a tired but dedicated woman named Maria Flores. He toured the workshop. It was clean but sparse. The saws were old, the lathes were wobbly, and the hand tools were a motley collection of worn-out donations. Yet, he saw the focus in the eyes of the young men working there. He saw the same spark he'd had as a boy in his grandfather's shed. He saw a hunger to create, to build something real and lasting with their own two hands. After the tour, he sat with Maria in her small office. He didn't tell her the whole story. He just told her he was a local woodworker who had recently come into some good fortune and wanted to give back to the community that had, in its own quiet way, given him so much. He wrote a check. When Maria unfolded it, her eyes widened and filled with tears. Mr. Okafor, I don't understand. Is this a joke? She stammered, holding the check with trembling hands. No, ma'am, Marcus said quietly. It's not. The check was for $5 million, enough to build a new state-of-the-art facility, buy the best equipment in the world, and endow scholarships for decades to come. I want you to call it the Joseph Okafor Center for Traditional Crafts, Marcus said, honoring the grandfather who had taught him the soul of the wood. The only condition is that you teach the boys that the value of their work isn't in the price someone is willing to pay, but in the honesty of the hands that create it. Maria could only nod, speechless. Marcus left her office and walked out into the afternoon. He felt lighter than he had in years. The money, which had always felt abstract and unreal, had finally become real. It wasn't just numbers on a page anymore. It was the future of 100 young men. It was the legacy of his grandfather. It was the foundation of his new life. He drove to his new workshop, the large, airy space that smelled of pine and possibility. He walked over to his workbench, where the pieces of the cedar armoire lay waiting. He picked up his grandfather's hand plane. The wood was cool and smooth in his palm, a familiar comfort. He set the plane to the edge of a cedar plank and pushed. A perfect paper-thin shaving curled up, releasing a fragrant woody perfume into the air. In the quiet hum of his workshop, surrounded by the spirits of the trees he so loved, Marcus Okafor began to build again. Not for a hotel in Dubai, not for a collector in London, but for himself. He was a woodworker, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt he was building a life that was truly and completely his own. He was no longer a secret. He was just a man who knew his own worth, a worth measured not in dollars, but in the silent, steady dignity of his craft. 6 months later, Marcus opened a woodworking school for at-risk youth in Charleston. He never spoke publicly about the divorce, but every student who walked through those doors knew his story, not because he told it, but because it was carved into the sign above the entrance, built from what they tried to break.